Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining this much needed and awaited event. Our thanks to the speakers who agreed to participate and to make contribution to the themes of this event. Now, this event has been brought forward as a result of events both in Sudan and South Sudan, and particularly for the need for the younger generation of Sudan and South Sudan to express their views and aspiration for the future of their respective countries. Now, in recommending speakers for this event, I have received help from Nuna Tijani, who is going to be a speaker, very kindly, and also from Makor, Bonam Alwal, Jean Hartley from the Open University, and Aisha Arabi, and our thanks to them for their contribution. Our thanks also goes to Caroline Davis for her excellent organizational skill and administrative help. To Dr. Richard Barltrop, a trustee of the program who will be chairing the session on a Q&A after the conclusion of the presentations. Kindly note that you can send written question to Dr. Richard during the presentation or raising your hand as indicated on the bar below the screen if there will be time to answer these questions by the speakers. Now, in a view of the number of speakers, I envisage about 10-15 minutes for each speaker, and thus I ask the speakers if they could kindly observe this limitation. Now, I'm very glad to see that many of the speakers today are young women, professional young women. I'm not sure you remember, except Anis and Richard will remember, we had in 2007, we organized a conference, the Sudanese Programme at St. Anthony's College, on the young, professional young Sudanese women, both Sudanese and Southern Sudanese. And that was really created quite a lot of interest and also appreciation of the contribution of young women are doing. And it's very sad, some of the people express the view saying, yeah, we need your expertise to go back to your countries. And many of them express the view, well, if I go back to your country, I will not get the same job as I am working in the United Kingdom or anywhere else, or the same salary. So there are impediments to this. I mean, in particular, if I may just mention two, some of you, I think Anis remember, and Richard, is Pamela Lomoro. She is an oil engineer, and now she is working on the northeast coast of Scotland, near Aberdeen, dismantling rigs, oil rigs. I mean, it's an enormous technological feat. And there is Southern Sudan producing oil, and she is working here rather than in South Sudan. So there are problems, endemic problem of this idea, not incorporating the younger generation with all their contribution into the running of the state. Is a very sad story. People talk just politics, but they don't concentrate on how much the younger generation can contribute to the future of their countries and to incorporate them into the state. But let us hope that you will be able to tackle some of these issues from your presentation. We will talk to Elizabeth. She is an economist and research assistant and a permanent fellow of the United States Institute for Peace. She is talking about foreign aid in a fragile state, opportunities and challenges, the case of Republic of South Sudan. She had assumed many positions internationally in Kenya and I think in United States. And we look forward to her contribution on this. Okay, Elizabeth, thank you very much for agreeing. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, and thanks to the Sudanese Programme initiative for giving me this great opportunity. I have prepared about 12 slides, and I thought I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to run quickly through this so that I don't miss anything. Right away to jump into this, and without exhausting time on Marshall Plan, and how aid was formed after the Second World War in 1947, there has been some sort of altered connotation around the definition of foreign aid itself. So, however, I view aid as a complex political and economic, open-ended commitment aimed at financing economic development in developing countries and including fragile states. There are there are many different forms of aid, but I'll just mention a few. Emergency aid, known as humanitarian aid, military aid, and economic aid, which I'm going to focus on today. So economic foreign aid comes in the forms of bilateral, multilateral, and non-government or organization funds. Most of these funds are concessional loans, um, economically known as official development assistance, ODA, and they're mainly given for the purposes of poverty elevation and economic promotion, economic development promotion. Now, ODA is a multifunctional, multidimensional, and complex narrative that economists debated for long on whether it does or does not promote economic growth. However, it still remains one of the leading symphonies for paying governments, public expenditure, increase overall GDPs in the South. Looking into how does aid work? Principally, foreign aid was anticipated to fill in the gap between domestic savings and investment caused by resource mismatching or misallocation strategies in the financial system. However, it is widely condemned for imposing political conditions and modification over these policies of the recipient countries, which I found to be paradoxical to the causality of aid itself. Further, this statement invokes my thought, and it makes me think about why giving aid, why receiving aid, and the necessity of aid. Giving aid for how long, and aid effectiveness. So talking about aid effectiveness, it is quite controversial because of the uniqueness of the political and economic circumstances of each recipient country. ODA seems to be an open-ended and permanent source of income that the African governments have stopped thinking about having any forms of capital and consequently getting trapped in the cycle of aid dependency. So apart from military aid and humanitarian aid, which we're not talking about today, there seems to be no room for serious intervention. The fundamental critique of aid not yielding development in South Sudan in general, and generally in Africa, is the element of corruption. However, I think that placing the disappearance of corruption as a precondition to economic development is equally unlogical because corruption exists anywhere, everywhere, and everyone is dealing with corruption. South Sudan just needs to activate the right legal mechanisms that can fight and reduce it accordingly. On the other hand, the debate about whether investment comes after good institutions or vice versa is quite challenging because leaders tend to have like a blind eye on the root causes and go after the wrong variables. They often choose to discuss corruption alternatives in Africa. They choose not to discuss corruption alternatives, but rather ask for alternative funds, like more and additional funds. South Sudan growth narrative, despite of everything, emerged, despite of the unsound leadership and weak institutions. Therefore, I think it's important for us, the young generation, to focus on prioritizing national gain and doing the right thing. I have an illustration for aid impact here and how it works, but I can just read it quickly. So whenever we inject aid into an economy, it goes like indirect and direct impact. So the direct impact normally shows in altering income as a direct outcome of any aid project. When it comes to the indirect impact of it, that goes into two divisions, public sector and private sector. The private sector aid normally alters relative prices, but in the public sector, it releases an equivalent value of resources that can be used for so many things such as tax reduction, borrowing cost reduction, increase in government expenditures, etc., etc. I'm going also to discuss briefly foreign aid in South Sudan, which is my favorite topic. So the country has received over 11 billion US dollars in foreign aid since 2005. largely from the US, the UK, the EU, without mentioning the non-DAC donors. These are just the DAC donors. So consequently, inflation picked up over 800% per year in October 2016, dropped. I want you guys to pay attention to these numbers because it's crazy. Dropped to 118% in 2017 and continued dropping until it got to 33% into 2021. Yet it is still relatively high. South Sudan is loaded by considerable amount of debt because of the increased military spendings and high levels of government corruption. Economic mismanagement, I believe, is prevalent. Civil servants, including police and the military, are not paid on time. There is a lot of austerity measures that were imposed into the government since I used to work in South Sudan, that about 4 years ago or something. So the government has been funding its expenditures by borrowing from the central bank and foreign sources using advanced sales of oil as collateral. South Sudan relies heavily on official development assistance to deliver basic social services, which amounted to nearly 7 times the size of the national budget in 2017, and that was about 2.2 billion USD. And in 2019, it amounts to 1.8 billion, which is not less. I mean, just a relative difference. Briefly, I wanted us to break down foreign aid in South Sudan from 3 different prospects. So the economic prospect of it. With the floods and the famine spreading, 66% of the population in South Sudan live on less than $2 a day. According to the World Bank, about 80% of the population live in rural areas and depend on fishing or home farming to survive. This vast majority of population is totally dependent on subsistence, agriculture, and humanitarian assistance. Taking into consideration the current circumstances of slow economic growth, immigration, movement, serious concerns about debt and deficits, the dynamics of the EU, Brexit, Greece, etc., it is just unlogic and unfair for US, for instance, to continue aiding South Sudan while it borrows money from China to sustain itself. It's a bit awkward. So the second point is aid is economically authoritative by second order effect. It stretches the propensity of not seeing the full potential of the untapped human resources and national resources. To further explain this, I prepared a lot of charts, but it's okay, I'll just explain it. I want us to quickly have a look at the relationship between aid flows rates in South Sudan and unemployment in South Sudan. So unemployment rates has been stagnant at the ratio of 12% since 2011, which is quite high relative to another fragile states in the region, such as Ethiopia, 2.08%, Eritrea, 5.14%, DRC Congo, 4.24%, Syria, 8.37%, and Niger, 0. These are all fragile states, but with very, very relatively low rates of unemployment. Again, if you just go to the World Bank website and check the gross capital formation, I won't show it now, or the GDP rates, it will also show you how the curve is like permanently going down. So you wonder, why is aid increasing over time while all these indicators are going down? It's a bit controversial. So on the other hand, the non-DAC development projects, such as the ones that China offers in the region, are quite risky in terms of their flexibility and prolonged loaning conditions. China offers also lack a very unique element that the DAC donors provide, such as knowledge and skills spillover. And this is something that is very, very important when we're doing development project. We should always make sure to have a win-win situation, not just, yeah, so that's it. The argument about export and import sector not equating to 15%.
Can you wind up your discussion, please?
All right, I'm going to skip the health prospect, which and also there is the political prospect of it. to jump into the challenges. There are so many challenges. Okay, the predicament illustrates in a wider problem associated with recovering fragile states. To begin with the challenges itself. I'm not going to go through everything. I'll just mention a few. Uncontrolled fun. States emerging from conflict often experience a commodity export. And in the end of any conflict, it allows for an intensification of economic activity. And this is not happening in South Sudan. In economic terms, we call it aid flows, represent additional revenues for countries, and also has to do with the raising exchange rate. But all this is not happening. So the second one is the absence of peace, of course, like my sister just mentioned. The conflict in South Sudan involves so much, and there are peace brokers in between, and they're influencing development in the country. Institutional setup is another challenge. Weak institutions are a major challenge for aid to yield tangible development results. To jump into the opportunities quickly, this is the most part that I love because I'm not an opportunist, but from my personal experience, opportunities take people to places. So aid gives a wide opportunity for an open trade market or trade liberalization, which is very, very important for a country landlocked like South Sudan, just to briefly mention. The second thing is that aid makes a great opportunity for attracting FDI, foreign direct investment. Also, if administered well, foreign aid can promote economic development in the long run. We have the case of Rwanda. The last opportunity is that aid provides humanitarian aid in particular, it saves lives. It has been proven theoretically and empirically. My last policy recommendations are very few. We have to attain peace and sustain peace in South Sudan. We need major economic reforms. We have to diversify the economy other than falling into debt disease and adopt new aid policies for both recipients and also the donors. Thank you so much. I hope I did not exhaust much of my time.
Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to have to cut you short, is the time limitation, but actually you put your fingers on some important issue, and I'm sure Richard will have something to say. He dealt with aid and the politics of aid in Sudan particularly. But thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth, for your presentation. We turn now very briefly to Haneen Ahmed Abdullah Ahmed. Haneen?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, you are here there, okay. Haneen is a founder of Youth Coalition to Support Peace and Economic Development. She is professional businesswoman and member of Youth Leadership Program for Innovative Solution for Sustainable Development, Youth and Women Trainee and Project Coordinator. And Haneen is going to talk to about women and youth political participation, priorities and challenges, the case of Republic of Sudan. Haneen, you have between 10 and 15 minutes. I'll monitor that. Okay, Haneen.
Okay.
Ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. Salam alaikum. Thank you for this great chance and my great colleagues also. So I'm going to have an introduction about the military coup of al-Bashir came in 1989, came under the name of the Islamic Civilization Project, launched under the idea of the civilization of population under the umbrella of Islamism. The Islamization public behavior was institutionalized in a separated group represented in Public Order Law, Criminal Law 1991, and the Person Status Laws 1996. The public order set generalized value to control the relation between people within society and the indication of the state participation in the organization of the personal affairs and the formation of the committees to monitor these laws that were distinguished between the righteous and the deviant citizens. This concept permeates the institution, media, and education system, courts, and committees. So when evaluating these projects, the prevalence of the non-Muslim Negroes population cannot be underestimated. And we should also take in the education crisis, the Islamic regime has started to changing the curricula without a scientific basis, from the one-sided ideological perspective, based on the memorization, not on the criticism, thinking, and creativity, because their plans was to work to create a culture of the submission and the suppressive of the political participation that resulted of 1 million children out of the education, according to the UNICEF, and the illiteracy rate raised to 57% according to the National Literacy Council. So young people and women are the mostly affected by this economic situation. Also, the opportunities are very restricted. Were very restricted to the hoods who are loyal to the regime. According to that, unemployment rate increased, where women the more affected. Also, the last unemployment statistic, according to the Ministry of Labor, is 34% for male, 45% for females, and 25% for diplomas holders, as 2018 statistic. In addition, that's the problem of the, as Swaiba mentioned, the problem of the conflicts and displaced people. That's led people to, or led individuals, young people, to restore solution individually by legal and illegal immigration. One of the famous stories, that's Harun, an illegal Sudanese immigrant who crossed the English Channel in a very poor situation in 2015. The notion of the participation defines the political participation as a group of practice the citizen carries out, or by which they press in order to participate and make an implementation, monitoring, and evaluating the political decision in a participation free from the pressure and the authority may exert on them. The participation was embodiment, not a real participation, because inclusivity of the regime does not allow a real participation. Even the constitutional constitutional document of the Baas regime in 1998 granted that the participation of women is 25 for the legislative and executive bodies, but in fact it were not more than 15 or 10% in executive and legislative body, and by 10% in the popular committees. That was like a 5%. Though there was no youth participation at the level of the ministries and legislative council. According to Dr. Dirar, Good Governance paper, Good Governance and Freedom by UNDP 2016. The early first decades of the 21st century represented the emergence of the new generation in the context of political despotism under the authorization of the regime. The political parties that were slow and separated from the reality of the people. The gap widened with the entry of the social media, with the formation of the new societal structure. And the withdrawal from the political sphere has emerged in many forms, political, including the university student unions, cultural salons, and associations. There was a trend of the voluntary work organization called the voluntary explosion. A huge number of voluntary work organization appeared, which formed an alternative incubator of the political parties and government participation. This incubator, in turn, contributed to the formation of the youth vision toward the change, as the young people and women touched the roots of the problems and found that it cannot be solved by the voluntary actions or humanitarian assistance. So the idea of the political participation in its transitional sense absence, and that means changing the priorities of the young people and So the change has become progressive, not descending. Perhaps one of the most famous body in the voluntary work like Sadagat, not to oppress women, La لقهر النساء, were formed in 2010. A news committee against Dal and Kajibar in a northern state to 2007, and Association of the Darfur lawyers in 2005. So they created their own theater and space for work and political expressions. What make it simmering under the surface? The youth and women united on the idea of uprooting the regime in 2010 after the South Sudan succeeded. Besides the economic crisis occurred and the economic policies and the corruption in 2012, demonstrating took out on the streets to refuse the Islamist regime, as well as on the streets and on the political level leadership. In the same year, the Sudanese Professional Association was formed. It's a Sudanese Professional Association is a trade union body that had affected a role in a revolutionary movement. In 2013, the regime applied economic liberalization policies and affected young people and women greatly. And the contribution, the coordination of the resistance committee was also divided into the current form. And the years that follows 2013, the domains of the youth coordination of the street increased, whereas continuous economic and security deterioration or the revolution broke out and appearance Faris demonstrate in the Mazin and Rosaries in the Blue Nile, calling for the fall of the regime. After the revolution, despite I think all of you see that how the revolution was great, and youth participation was fully, and youth and women participation was fully in the revolution. Despite this large participation, young people and young women and women as well. So they are also signed the declaration. They have a great participation in the revolution and demonstration in the setting in front of the army headquarters. Many of them signed the Declaration of the Freedom and Change, but the women and youth have remained excluded from the decision-making bodies in the large extent. In spite of the media disclosure keen to involve them in the participation, youth and women on the political map incubator. In the beginning, there was transparency between youth and the political parties, and they have some voice to choose one of the members in executive and sovereign council, like a Taashi, but by now, young women and civil society is still weak. In spite of the constitutional document, Juba Peace Agreement granted participation by women should be 40% for women, 40% for women, and they insist to participate for the resistance committees. Young women and civil societies organization led wide movement to object the weak presentation, such as Khamsin movement that settled by female representation by 50%, and the group of female, my group Guardians, we submitted a constitutional appeal against weak women participation to against the Juba Peace Agreement due to weak women participation, and the youth movement is still continuing on the streets due to government marginalized to achieve the goals of the youth and the revolutions. Conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The main problem, I think, it's not the individuals or it's a state structure itself more than the individual. We should have to have a real and comprehensive participation. We should have a natural state with a normal relationship with the citizen in form of the rights and duties. So reforming the security and economy sectors and invest in youth, because we are a young country. The youth percent is up to 60% of the population. Okay, the priorities and challenges. I invest.
No, that is quite a lot, really.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So priorities and challenges differ from one region to another, but they are all agreed on that they should fight against the dark Islamic thoughts rooted in the society and political, society, social and economic, because they should have enlightening, open-minded to lead them to the elections and have achieving democracy and peace, involving women and using decision making and implementing and evaluating the process, and letting the stakeholders speak about themselves, adopting the accountability mechanism in the face of the corruption, providing a transparency decision making in institutions. The challenges.
If you could have one sentence at the end to wind up your discussion, we'll be grateful. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that one sentence. Challenges are a lot, but
yes.
We should. The most challenges are the absence of the strategic visions towards the futures. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
That's exactly. Thank you very much indeed, Haneen. That's exactly. But I think you have, maybe you will be asked a question. Over 100 young people, men and women, died to topple Bashir. What the result of all this in relation to changing the structure of Sudanese society? That is the question. How much they have achieved? It's still there. Bashir regimes, Bashir structures are still there. Anyhow, that may be, raised in question and answer. We move now to Muram Nafi'. She has an experience into the NGO sector in Sudan, voluntary experiences have in the United Kingdom, focusing on gender development with reference to the protection of young girls and women. And her interest in the FGM and honor-based abuse, which are two issues, social issues, appear even recently, for example, honor in Pakistan and sort of Jordan and the Middle East is a big issue. And she works in the administrative sector of the Churchill Hospital, Oxford, and she is a graduate in International Relations and Politics, University of Northampton. She's going to talk about women, young girls, and FGM in the Republic of Sudan. Okay, Muram, you've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed and the Sudanese Programme for this opportunity.
Yes.
So my presentation is going to focus on women, young girls, and FGM in the Republic of Sudan, mainly raising the issue of protection, I'd say. So before I go into female genital mutilation, I'd like to briefly speak on the protection of women and young girls in Sudan, and mainly the government's role in this. So in 2019, I was lucky enough to work for CARE International in Khartoum. And during my time with CARE, I was able to visit Kassala State in Eastern Sudan. This was to supervise a session on the nutrition project that was running at the time. And many of the mothers that attended the session were between the ages of 12 to 15 years old, with at least 1 to 2 children each. To me, this was very surprising, actually. And when I raised this, I was informed that a lot of them were married off between the ages of 10 to 11, even some of them even before starting their menstrual cycle. When I started to question this a bit, I was told that the reason for this was because many families believe that it's their obligation to protect their young girls from any immoral behavior, also known as sutra in Sudan. So in addition to obviously not damaging the family, not bringing shame and not damaging the family honor and name as well. So, I mean, that overall obviously raises the issue of gender discriminatory norms within Sudan and why society only focuses on girls and women rather than preventing the men from marrying the young girls. So it also kind of raises the issue of why there isn't a set law that's preventing child marriage within Sudan. I mean, I think at the moment there's no legal age for marriage in Sudan because we follow the Sharia law. But I mean, the Sharia law in general states that when a woman reaches the time of, starting her menstrual cycle, that's when she is suitable to get married. So I think also there's the Sudan's Muslim Personal Act of 1991 that states that a child matures from the age of 10 years old. And I think a lot of people use this as a way to actually, use this as a way to legalize marriage at a young age. So I think we as the youth need to find a way to dismantle this tradition, of course, mainly focusing on the elder generation, I'd say, because they are the ones that obviously make these rules. They are the ones that go along with these traditions. And I think one thing that I need to say is that we need to not only focus on Khartoum. I mean, Sudan's not just Khartoum. There are many different states within Sudan. So we need to try and tackle these issues by reaching out to different states. I think throughout the whole session, the nutrition session, it kind of made me raise the question of what role does the state and institution play in the protection of women and young girls? And to me, I think they play a major role in this. For example, like I said, the absence of a clear law which criminalizes child marriage in Sudan. Why has this not happened before? This is something that we need to question. Why is it now that suddenly now everyone's talking about this? I think also another drawback of the institution comes from government representatives such as the police, the militia, and those are the people who have obviously been put in place to protect the citizens, yet the threat that they impose has created a wider issue. And this is obviously seen throughout the genocide in Darfur and also throughout the military headquarters sit-in. So I think what they do is they don't tackle the issues and they don't stand with women and young girls. Instead, they blame them for what they're doing. So blame them for the way that they're dressed. They blame them for going out at different times or late at night. They blame them for attending these protests and marches where they believe it's not socially acceptable for them to attend. So I think though, if we're talking about the development at the moment, I think recently Sudan has ratified the UN 1979 Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, also known as TDAO. And even though it's a major step forward for all of us, like we can see that this is we're going in the right direction, but we've taken a few steps back as I think the majority of the council being male refused to accept the notion that they refused to accept the notion of women being equal to men in social and political levels, in addition to obviously having equal rights when it comes to marriage, divorce, and parenting. And I think we as a nation have to recognize that this stops women from making certain decisions. It prevents women from refusing a forced marriage. It prevents them from refusing to get married at such a young age. And also in terms of finding their own husband or getting married without their guardian's approval, and in Sudan known as Wali Amr, which is usually known as the father, the uncle, or brother. So someone of that state. So I think it's something that we need to have a look into. And in terms of divorce and women not having a right to ask for a divorce, this can put a lot of women at great risk because many of them could be in abusive relationships. We have to just think of it as a whole and how this affects women. I also think that this highlights the role that society in general plays in the protection and development of women and girls within Sudan and the wider community as well. So I believe that there are many cultural barriers that prevent women from gaining equal rights in Sudan. But I also think that it's a lot of, culture intertwined with an extreme form of religion and misinterpretation, I think. Which I think we need to, as a nation, as the youth, as a diaspora, we need to combat this through distinguishing the difference between culture and religion, and also raising awareness of this. So I think it's something that we can do. It's yes, it might take some time, but it's definitely something that we can do. Now, if we're talking about female genital mutilation, FGM, or female, a lot of people call it female genital cutting. It's a practice that's very common in Sudan. And I think this is another example of how the government are trying to use religion as a way to justify the negative cultural practices. The reason I say it's another example is because I think in 1949, Sudan attempted to criminalize the most severe form of FGM, also known as infibulation, and some people know it as type 3. But they permitted type 1 and referred to it as the Sunnah form of FGM. Now, we all know that, well, as a lot of you know, the word Sunnah is known as the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And therefore, I think FGM is often seen as a religious practice within Sudan rather than cultural. I think in 2014, there was a survey that showed around that over 86% of women between the ages of 15 and 49 were affected by FGM, which leads us to question why the government was still allowing this practice to continue. And if we look at where FGM stems from, there are, I think, a number of reasons. I just think they're mainly cultural practices and cultural reasons, but I think it's a way of, attempting to control the woman's sexuality and preserve the sexual purity of young girls. So I think this derives mainly from, obviously, early cultural practices that are often carried out by grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and I think in more recent years it was midwives as well. But I think it's also what they think of it is as to increase the cleanliness and increase the daughter's marriageability status. So as most of you know, this practice is very outdated and causes so much harm, and times resulting in death during the process or further down the line when it comes to childbirth. Although it's often carried out by females, I do think that men have contributed majorly to the practice of FGM in Sudan. And I think it's believed that men used to only marry those that have gone through the process as a way to control the female, with many demanding a wife that is pure. I also think that the community has played a major role in the contribution of FGM, with families believing that if they choose to deviate, their daughter will not be demanded for marriage, also known as Baira, within the Sudanese community. So within recent years, I think that the communities have chosen not to speak on this topic, specifically within the urban areas of Sudan. And although the government has previously allowed for this practice to continue, it's now illegal in Sudan. The transitional government criminalized FGM in 2020, and I think it's a major step forward in the development of Sudan and the recognition of women's rights. But I also do think that traditions and cultural customs can have an effect on the community-written laws. And we can see this in the Red Sea region of Sudan, where FGM was banned in 2007. However, religious and tribal leaders used their influence to not impose the ban on it being Sunnah and tradition. I think the youth in general have contributed extensively to the development of the country, from organizing protests, marches, being at the front line of these protests, and raising awareness through social media. I believe that in some recent events have allowed the younger generations to have a positive outlook on the future of Sudan. But I think at the moment, it's just they're fed up. So it doesn't seem that they'll stop until major change occurs. So I think at the moment, when it comes to the youth, there isn't much of fear of being judged, which really helps with tackling many social challenges. And I think social media platforms such as Twitter will allow the youth to openly stand up and fight for their rights. Although it may take a few years, I do think that it will have that they will have a positive impact on the development of Sudan and women's rights in general.
Good. Thank you very much, Muram. Really, you discussed a very important issue with all the social and political ramification. If perhaps you sort of reflect, if there are political and religious stipulation against FGM. I think, and you said it is a cultural thing, and therefore it's extremely important to deconstruct the thinking about FGM, not only by men, but also by women. They are interlocked, this issue. So perhaps you think this is what it needed. I mean, the law against it since the late 19th, early 20th century, but nobody pays attention. It is to really change the mind. And it is your generation, people think of the future and abandon this horrendous custom, which is internationally condemned. But thank you very much. I'm sure you will get some question. Now, our next speaker is Amal Osman. Amal, you may have seen her before. She came to give a wonderful talk on motherhood to our conference on women writers of the Sudan and South Sudan. She published that paper. We published that paper in a book. Amal, she is co-founder of the Creative Writing from the Sudan Project Writers, and she is an MA student in Education and International Development at University College London. Amal has been attending, quite a lot of our functions in the past. So we welcome her, and she is going to talk about the power of the creative arts in giving youth a voice and path to political participation in the Republic of Sudan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for inviting me to speak and for the introduction. So as Dr. Ahmed mentioned, I'll briefly be speaking about the power of the creative arts in giving youth a voice and a path to political participation in Sudan as well. I'm deeply invested in strengthening institutions and establishing initiatives that support and foster the creative arts among Sudanese society and also help us to reconstruct our cultural institutions. So I'm going to start off with a little personal anecdote that is a little sad, but one that's not uncommon for the creatives in our communities. So in 2010, I moved to Sudan with the intention to study university, and I had a passion for literature, being the avid reader that I am. So I naturally applied to the University of Khartoum, Faculty of Arts, to study English and French, and was accepted, thankfully. When I told my friends and relatives, everyone was really confused. I had comments like, you came from England, home of English literature, to study English in Khartoum University. I received other comments like that, such as, why didn't you study medicine, dentistry, pharmacy? I had to tell people time and time again that I had a love for literature, for storytelling, and I wanted to see that passion through. So it was within these conversations and many others like it that I had two really saddening realizations. The first was that it seemed to me amongst the younger generation that the idea of having a passion for the arts and pursuing it in education wasn't something that was very common. It seemed that medicine, pharmacy, engineering, and other science-based paths were deemed as the most worthy pursuits. And I guess this realization also spurred on the second realization, which was that the arts in Sudan had lost its respect and its value. Even at institutions like the University of Khartoum, which used to be a leading university in the country and also in Africa more widely. So it became a sort of mission of mine to be a part of its resurrection in any way I could. This mini mission sort of guided me in the production of the anthology of the creative writing anthology, I Know Two Sudans, in 2014, which stemmed from the creative writing from the Sudanese Project that I'm a co-founder of. So one of the primary aims of the book was to give Sudanese people, and the youth in particular, a platform to express their thoughts creatively about the Sudans. The enthusiastic response that we got, my team and I, from the people when we launched the project was extremely telling. People were excited about being offered an accessible opportunity that enabled them to engage with Sudan creatively at a time when it seemed that there wasn't much room for that anywhere else. Of course, our recent political, social, cultural history really explains why there was such a thirst for creative outlets, and also why there is a current underdevelopment of our arts and cultural sectors. The fragility of the post-independence and post-colonial state of Sudan, the continued rise of Islamism, especially under Bashir's 30-year rule, all have had major impacts on the country. Some of the effects have been positive and some negative. In my opinion, most have been negative, but that's a story for another day. One of the most negative effects, particularly during Bashir's regime, was the death of the creative arts in the Sudan, at least those that were the creative arts that were created publicly, experienced and enjoyed publicly as well. Over the last 30 years, Sudan's creativity has been majorly hampered and forcibly made diasporic. The stories of imprisonment and exile from some of our most known creatives like Ibrahim Salehi or Tayyip Saleh are not uncommon to the average creative in Sudan. For the past few decades, this has been arguably the most common experience of anyone who has really looked to raise their voice and be critical through a creative medium. So this climate of fear that was cultivated by the former regimes effectively made the creative and cultural scene an underground solace instead of being one that's publicly accessible to all. And it has disproportionately affected the youth, so who make up the majority of Sudan's population currently. Right now, over 60% in Sudan are between the ages of 0 to 24, so I hope that puts things into perspective. The creative disempowerment of Sudan has had its most profound impact on the youth, who are bustling with creativity and with no places to output it. So I'm arguing that it's now time to reclaim our creative arts fully and publicly and work to construct a Sudanese future filled with creativity and innovation. The time has really come to rebuild our cultural institutions. I don't mean to say that there has not been any creativity in Sudan in the last couple of decades, because don't get me wrong, there has. Wonderful progress has been made in the last couple of years. There are organizations and initiatives like Andaria magazine, Nas with notepads, 500 Word magazine, Kamakol Festival, Local Sudan, Mojo Gallery, the Manga Radio. These are all groups and organizations that have been at the forefront of really creating spaces for the creative arts and showcasing the creative talents within Sudan. And they've also played a key part in providing these spaces for the youth to participate in society. But still, even with these phenomenal organizations, I would argue that for the average Sudanese person and young person, the creative arts in these forms was still not accessible or known. And many of these organizations I mentioned had been founded by those within the diaspora. And despite their best aims, they've not been able to safely function or completely work within Sudan's national boundaries because of the former regime's censorship. However, there has been a recent turning point, which we're all very pleased about, and that was resulting from the revolution. So we're now in the midst of shaping a new narrative for ourselves. The 2019 revolution was a major catalyst that has shifted the creative arts in Sudan to the forefront of public eye. The amount of creativity that exploded from just the sit-in site alone, like the poetry, the spoken word pieces, the music, the murals, the mini films and documentaries that I got a chance to see, these are all all of these pursuits have been a testament to the creativity within the people. And with young people making up the majority of those that were on the streets protesting, the sit-in site showed just how much the youth have been waiting to showcase their artistic talents publicly. So after years of assault on the cultural scene by the Bashir regime, the revolution really helped to unleash very publicly the creative talents of young Sudanese society. And though the sit-in site I'm referencing was located in the capital, with the help of the internet and social media, which Moram recently referenced as being a major key support in youth development, the murals that were painted on walls of inner city Khartoum were seen on the phone screens all over the country. You can see them on screens in Sinnar, Ta'atbarat, Al-Damazin, and even beyond to the Sudani diaspora, that are abroad, which are people like myself. Social media made a path for this creativity to really visit each and every one of us, inspire us, and hold us in awe. And it was the youth that were leading the charge, not only in the social revolution, but also the cultural revolution that was taking place too. It was the youth who were raising their voices and painting, literally and figuratively, the picture of Sudan that they wanted to fight for. So the creative arts forged a path for them to engage politically and contribute to the movement. I read a really great comment by Mustafa Abu Shama in one interview, and he's the owner of Mojo Gallery in Khartoum. And he said that when the revolution happened, the whole world was seeing these amazing murals on the walls in Sudan. Art was always underground, but the revolution brought it to the forefront. It brought it to the public. Every person I've spoken to about the revolution and their experience of the sit-in site really expressed the same sentiments. They all spoke about how the sit-in site held a space for unity, creativity, and inspiration. They spoke about the power of the chants, the songs, the poems, the murals, all of these things that continue to really empower those participating, particularly the youth, to continue to fight for social justice and a fairer future for themselves. Asil Diab as well, who's a graffiti artist that's known as Suda Love, and who became known for her outdoor murals that she painted that were honoring the martyrs, said that she chose murals specifically as a medium because they started dialogues and conversations with the community, and it also speaks on behalf of many people. She stated that whether you were with or against the revolution, you're forced to be reminded of what is going on. What really spoke to me about her work is that she didn't just do murals of those fallen in the current protests, but she also included those martyrs that had previously lost their lives within the years of Bashir's regime. So she used the current social context to make a statement that connects the past and the present, and in doing so, the call for change became much stronger. Her murals bear witness to the recent history and the present reality. If they didn't actively call for your support to the movement, they remain powerful simply for their existence and resistance to a narrative that's been perpetuated by the state that doesn't really represent the reality of the injustices that have been taking place. If the walls could talk, it would speak these tales of resistance. The creative arts are important to any society, but I would say they're even more important to a society that has been suffering under an oppressive regime and silence for decades. The arts can transform any conversation, and it can inspire reflection and dialogue. Interact with your preferred medium, and the arts can reshape our thinking and our actions too. It has the capacity to express the histories, the hardships, the hopes of every group. And the creative arts has the capacity to provide an emotional catharsis for people, to spread joy, healing amidst great trauma that we've experienced. And it also works to galvanize the people in support of a common cause for justice. And lastly, they're really a powerful medium of communication and culture that really greatly contribute to society and provide an important platform for many people to get involved, in particular the youth. If all the things that I just mentioned above and stated weren't true, the Transitional Military Council would not have erased the art from the sit-in site after the unlawful dispersal of the protesters. And the erasure of that art and the murals and the poems that were written on the walls by the youth speaks to the threat of art in the public space. It speaks to its role as a record of what has happened and has continued to happen in the country. But this public erasure really needs to stop. So we are now what we all hope will be, a new phase in Sudan, right? One of re-nation building after years of deterioration from the inside out. The news of foreign investments to Sudan and clearing of debts has definitely been highly welcomed. And the anticipation for Sudan, how Sudan will shift over the next few years and begin the process of repairing its infrastructures is something that we're all, I can definitely say, keen to witness and to rejoice over as well. So my hope is that the cultural institutions which support the creative arts are not forgotten in this process of re-nation building, especially after what we've seen during the revolution and the important role that the creative arts had in empowering the youth to fight for Sudan. We need to really make sure that we prioritize it. Currently, there are not enough projects existing that directly are in support of the creative arts sectors. The Ministry of Culture and Information and the Ministry for Youth and Sports must be held accountable to ensure that due thought and investment is being given to the arts that has suffered from many or multiple decades of devaluation. So I hope that within these new national budgets, the creative arts are prioritized with the recognition that our cultural infrastructure needs to be ready to support the thriving innovation and creativity within young Sudanese society, and also provide spaces that can channel it appropriately. So they need to be ready to begin that support to foster the next generation that are already on the threshold of claiming the creativity and are looking for spaces to explore it fully. I'll leave it there.
Well, Amal, thank you very much indeed. Really, you gave us a very good background to the issue of art and freedom of expression, not only in writing, but also on canvases, which the last regime condemned, abstract art, which I know very well. But thank you very much, Amal. I'm sure you have a question. We got now, the next will be Bush Laki. Welcome. Now, Bush is interesting. He's a program coordinator of Whitaker, Peace and Development Initiative, youth activist, and co-founder. This is what I like, Take Tea Together. And I think that's really very interesting. He is going to talk about the role of youth in nation building, the Republic of Sudan and South Sudan. Go ahead, Bush. Welcome.
Thank you so much. This is Bush Buse from South Sudan. I'm very happy to join you today and this evening. I'm going to talk about the role of youth in nation building, the two republics of Sudan and South Sudan. These are two brotherly countries. And these two countries are just separated by by politics, you know, administratively they are separated, but the people of the two countries are still, they are the same. So to begin with, I would like to define the word youth first. In the context of Sudan and South Sudan, what do people understand by the word youth? United Nations, without prejudice to any other definitions made by the member states, defines youth as those persons between ages of 15 and 24 years. And then African Union, under the African Youth Charter, defines youth as those persons between the ages of 15 and 25. Now in South Sudan, this is where the problem is. We do not have a clear definition of youth. So we have the South Sudan Youth Development Policy, which defines youth as persons between 15 to 35, and this one has been amended to 18 to 35. So this one is still lying in the parliament. It has not been ratified. It has not been passed by the parliament. So in short, we do not have a policy for youth in South Sudan, which gives a clear definition of who a youth is. If you look at Sudan, Sudan has the same problem. In fact, South Sudan inherited this problem from Sudan, because also there is no clear definition of youth in Sudan. But they only say that the people, the age segment between 15 and 30 years constitute 60% of the population in Sudan. And here in South Sudan, youth constitute over 70% of the country's population. So this is just to give you an understanding of who a youth is before we go ahead. So you realize that there's so many people who are representing youth in the parliament, in the executives, in Sudan and South Sudan, who are not necessarily youth. This is because we do not have a clear definition of a youth. Now here in South Sudan, the people who are above 5 years, they are still representing youth in the parliament, the executives, they are holding positions, including chairpersons of youth associations. They are in fact not eligible to be called youth. They are there. Those ones at the moment, since we don't have a clear definition, we can call them senior youth. Senior, just for them to feel happy. So we try to advocate and lobby for a clear definition of youth through the South Sudan Youth Development Policy. Now let me talk about nation building, because we're talking about youth and nation building in the two republics. Nation building here refers to a constructive process of engaging all citizens in building social cohesion, economic prosperity, and political stability in a nation in an inclusive and democratic way. It is viewed as the development of behaviors, values, language, institutions, and physical structures that elucidate history and culture, concretize and protect the present, and ensure the future identity and independence of a nation. So these are the two things that we're going to talk about. If I move forward and talk about youth, I put this acronym, youth, Y-O-U-E-H, and I added S, so that it is plural. This one, I said young organizers united to harmoniously succeed. Now, when I say young organizers, I am referring to youth who constitute the biggest population in the two countries, in Sudan and in South Sudan. Youth or the young people are the majority. So they need to get organized, united, harmoniously succeed. So when I say to harmoniously succeed, it means that the change that the young people desire for the two countries should be in a non-violent manner, a peaceful way. That should be done through advocacy, through lobbying, through civic education, getting engaged in leadership, okay? And getting engaged in decision-making processes. We want to see young people getting into politics. We want to see young people sitting at the forefront together with the elders so that they define the country that they want. So this is why I say young organizers united to harmoniously succeed. Now, to succeed is to succeed in their activities and also to succeed the elders, okay? Now, these people are already all what we call the sunset generation. The young people are the sunrise generation. The sunrise generation have to take over from the sunset generation. These are people who are old. They only have little time to live on Earth. But then how should the transition be for young people to come in? It has to be done harmoniously, in a peaceful manner. Now, moving forward, we want to highlight some good examples from the two republics. The major roles played by the youth in Sudan and South Sudan. In the then Sudan, youth mainly from the southern region played a big role in the liberation struggle, which culminated into the independence of South Sudan. Dr. Garang, by then, when he went to the bush, he was a young man. He was a youth. In Sudan, the youth, who constitute about 60% of the country's population, played an instrumental role in ousting President Al-Bashir in 2019. The people who played that role, the majority of the people who played that role were young people. That generation of people from 15 to 30 years of age were all raised under the authoritarian rule of the National Congress Party, NCP. That's from 1989 to 2019. And they have not seen a Sudan without Omar al-Bashir as president. If you look at this age bracket, okay, President al-Bashir has been a president for 30 years, and then we have these youth who have been there for 30 years, and they have not seen any president. So this is one of the roles that the youth in Sudan and South Sudan have played. Unfortunately, the majority of young people in Sudan, South Sudan, were excluded from decision-making processes despite their great contributions. Okay, youth continue to suffer from the triangle of poverty, literacy, and employment, which increases their vulnerability, manipulation by warlords and negative politicians. This is common in Sudan and South Sudan. The rate of unemployment is very high. The rate of poverty is very high. And that makes young people vulnerable. They provide cheap labor to these warlords and negative politicians. So this is a challenge, despite all that they have played during the revolution or the struggle. Now, Sudan now initiated a plan to create a youth council, a shadow institution to coordinate youth in the neighborhood committees. There were also suggestions in the social media that representatives of the neighborhood committee should be nominated to have seats in the transitional assembly. The young people in Sudan have this challenge to ensure that they work hard, okay, to send young people into the parliament. The generation, we are in 21st century. We are different from people who are already old. So we want to see young people coming into the parliament, okay, to pass laws that are relevant to this century. This is our century. This is our world. So we want to see young people getting into politics. And the orientation that the Sudanese had by then was that politics is a bad thing. So people were told not to join politics, not even to study politics, just because it's a bad thing for young people, that politics is for the old people, is for the elders. It is time for us to decolonize our minds and assure our elders that politics is not a bad thing. It's a way of managing our society. It's a way of managing the two nations. Therefore, young people have to get into that. Now, in South Sudan, we have the youth organizations, which lobbied for more youth involvement in the parliament, the executive. So as we talk now, somehow there is a change in South Sudan. In that, many young people, there are a good number of young people who have already been appointed in the recently reconstituted Constitutional National Legislative Assembly
Bush, you have about less than 5 minutes, please.
Okay. For me to conclude, I would say that we have many young youth organizations like Anataban, the Take Tea Together, okay, which I'm part of. These organizations are doing amazing work. We have also in Sudan, we have this organization. So to conclude, I would say that youth, okay, they need to strengthen their position. So it strengthens young people's abilities to meet their own subsistence needs, prevent and reduce vulnerabilities to economic, political, and social unstable environment by tapping on the local resources. We do not have to depend on external funding to solve our own problems. We already have enough resources, but then how do we tap on those resources to liberate masses of the young people from poverty, from illiteracy and unemployment, promote ownership and sustainability of change interventions? And finally, because of time, I would say lasting peace and sustainable that the ultimate responsibility for lasting peace and sustainable development in the republics of Sudan and South Sudan rests on the shoulders of young people who are united, informed, educated, and patriotic. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Bush. Really excellent presentation. I'm sorry to have to cut you off because of time, but thank you. I'm sure there will be some question asked. Now we got 3 more speakers. I'm now going to Noon Tijani. So Noon is, she is at Green Templeton College in Oxford University. She is presenting her DPhil, PhD, soon, or she may have done so. Noon has been part of the Sudanese program for some years. You have seen her at the desk many times, and she has been a great help to us on many, many occasions. Her research area is in the health services and medical audits and maternal health in Sudan. She provided a clinical care and organized community outreach initiative in Sudan and South Africa. She presented her work in conferences, TV, and presentations. So she is going to talk about really very, very important challenges to improving maternal health in the Republic of Sudan. Okay, Noon, take it then. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here. Well, my presentation today, I'm going to talk about maternal health, and maternal mortality is being used as the key indicator for maternal health. So I'll address that, and I'm going to talk about how can maternal death be prevented, the challenges, and the way forward. I'm going to summarize quite a bit where I can. So maternal health is the health of women when they're pregnant, during childbirth, and in the postnatal period. So this is within 6 weeks afterwards. And globally, this is used as a proxy of the status of women worldwide. And maternal mortality is used as the key measure for maternal health. So if you could look at if we think of maternal health as a spectrum, the majority of women go through this journey without having any, the journey is uneventful, they don't really have any adverse outcomes, but for a very, very, very few of them, this could lead to either severe illness and disability and even death, which is quite rare. So even though it is used as an indicator, it's a very uncommon outcome of maternal health. But it is considered to be the tip of the iceberg, because the causes and all the risk factors that lead to maternal death really affect the health of women. And if we improve this, and if we're able to reduce maternal mortality, then this would have a knock-on effect to really improve maternal well-being. Maternal health is one of the issues that are very, very well studied. We know so much about it. We know what causes maternal death. We also know that the majority of these causes are preventable. We know that most women die in rural areas or at home who do not have access to facilities. And this is more likely to happen on the day during childbirth or within the first week of birth. However, we still find that the levels of maternal health are still quite high in lower and middle income countries. This is a framework that I really like using quite often that really shows us how countries go about and can progress in reducing maternal mortality. And it has 5 main stages. So the first main stage is when maternal mortality ratio, which is the key indicator for maternal death, is above more than 1,000 in 100,000 live birth. It's not very common to have a denominator that's 100,000 live birth, but this is just to show that even though it's very important, it's not a very common thing that happens. So if the maternal mortality ratio is over than 1,000, this really means that there's not much is being done to reduce maternal mortality. Women find it difficult to access healthcare, and this would be what's closest to a natural state of what would happen if we didn't have any medicine or any healthcare. And worldwide, there are only 3 countries that are in this stage, and these are countries that have had decades of war that have really affected the healthcare system. The second stage is when women start to go more to the hospital. There's reduction in fertility rates, and some women make it to the hospital. And in this case, we have issues around access to healthcare and quality of healthcare, and the maternal mortality ratio of the country would be somewhere between 300 to 999. Stage 3, and this is the tipping point for maternal health, and this is when more and more women are finding their way to the hospital, and their fertility rates are reducing. And here the main issue becomes the quality of care that women face in hospital. Once it becomes lower than that, then the main issues become something very different. For the context of Sudan, here I have a bar chart. On the x-axis, you can see the different states of Sudan, and on the y-axis, you can see their maternal mortality ratios. Please don't focus much on the numbers because these are likely underestimated. These are from the National Reports of Maternal Death. But what I'd like to show here is that in Sudan, we have a very big variety in terms of maternal mortality ratios. We can find in River Nile, it's about 40 per 100,000. And this is close to even tenfold in East Darfur state, East Darfur. And this helps us think of Sudan, if we're trying to work on improving maternal health, as two main problems. So the different states face very different problems to reduce maternal health. And here, just to summarize that maternal death is a really uncommon outcome of pregnancy and childbirth, but in Sudan, it's relatively high, and there are large varieties between states. And if we think of the obstetric transition framework that I've shown, we can see that in Khartoum, the central states and the northern state, more women make it to the hospital. So the main issue there is poor quality of care at the level of facility. But if we think of the majority of Sudan, so the Darfur region, the Kordofan region, and the eastern region, the main issues there are actually access to healthcare in the first place. So what can we do in Sudan to really help bring this down? Again, maternal health is really well studied, and we have proven strategies that have been proven time and time again in developing countries and developed countries, and when a lot of resources have been invested, and also when not so much resources have been put in place, that have succeeded. And these includes things like improving nutrition, improving the education of women, increasing facility birth, and things like safe abortion and family planning. So these have been proven to reduce maternal mortality, but in Sudan, we have quite a bit of challenges. And here I've divided them into three. So if we think of these challenges in terms of people, providers, and policies, and I've divided them this way just to help us really conceptualize the problem. This is not really to abortion blame to any one group. So if you think of people, maternal mortality has quite a lot of risk factors, and a study by Sid Ahmed in 2018 that looked into risk factors of maternal mortality in Sudan have found that they're quite consistent with risk factors worldwide, and I highlight three here. So the first one is fertility rate. So in Sudan, an average woman would have about 5 children, and this varies between rural and urban areas. But if we compare that to the global average of about 2 to 3 children per woman, we can see that we're still, fertility rates are quite high in Sudan. And this means that more women give birth, but as you give more children, your risk of having an adverse outcome increases. So we have more women giving birth, and we have more higher risk women. We also have high levels of child marriage in Sudan. So 2 out of every 5 marriages is a child married, and 3 out of every 4 women in Sudan gives birth at home. So we have a population that's also already at risk, and these are 2016 figures, so this is very recent. In terms of providers, WHO, one of the key methods to reduce maternal mortality to ensure that there is somebody who has the skills that can save a woman's life if needs be. So again, in the majority of cases, this is not really needed. Birth would go on uneventful, but in the lucky event where there's a complication, you need somebody with the skills to be able to do this. Worldwide, the target is to ensure 100% coverage. The actual target worldwide is about 80%, but in Sudan, this is only at 25%, so this is among the lowest worldwide. And in Sudan, we do have people who are trained to provide healthcare to women in Sudan, but these are midwives, and midwives would not really fulfill this definition. They do not have the skills to be able to provide this service. And although their numbers are increasing, it's very difficult to tell if this actually means there's going to be a reduction in maternal mortality in Sudan. And then the other issue in terms of provider is we do have skilled providers, and these are doctors, these are health visitors in Sudan, but their numbers have been really reducing. And it's in the past 2 decades, this has been really shocking, looking at data from the annual statistics report in Sudan. If we think about the policies, these are very contentious worldwide. So it doesn't matter which country we're talking about, which religion, the culture, the socioeconomic status of the country. These are very contentious topics. And Muram has spoken about female genital mutilation, so I'll skip that. We also have and child marriage, so I'll skip those. But if we think of things like family planning, abortion services, health literacy and sexual education, these are considered as best bets from WHO to reduce maternal mortality. But it's very difficult to have these kind of conversations in Sudan because, again, even though these are evidence-based policies, they are not necessarily culturally appropriate. And while I was preparing for this presentation, it's very difficult to find the word sexual in any maybe institute or any document that comes from Sudan or is targeted there. So it tells us that actually there's a lot of work that really needs to be done if we're going to improve maternal health in Sudan. Just to summarize again, there are many risk factors in Sudan, and even though we've made progress in increasing access to midwives, we don't really know if this actually means that we're going to improve maternal health because the level of their skills are not up to standard, and there is a decline, which is even more concerning in the number of skilled providers. And again, the evidence-based policies worldwide that focus on reducing maternal mortality are not culturally appropriate for our context. And just last to conclude and some final thoughts, because of the variety in maternal mortality across Sudan and the different states or stages that Sudan is in, we really need to focus on building infrastructure. There's no question about that. There's also need to improve the quality of facility deliveries across the country, and this can also help create demand to bring more women to deliver in hospital. There's and strengthening midwifery profession. I personally think that this is one of the main priorities that we have to focus on. And lastly, I think we need culturally appropriate policies. We see that there are a lot of policies and recently laws to help improve maternal mortality, but we cannot shy away from really talking about the main issues because we really need to have these difficult conversations to help save women's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Noon. Very admirable presentation regarding these issues. Again, thank you very much indeed. Now we have Aida Bashar. Aida is Social Policy Research Officer at the Economic Policy Research Institute, South Africa. And she is an incoming PhD candidate at Durham University. She has interest in Sudanese political history and African revolutionary movement, and with reference to popular uprising and anti-colonial thought. She is going to talk of something is going to happen next year, and that is the 2022 Sudanese general election historical patterns. Okay, Aida.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to listen to all the speakers. Everyone has really interesting experience. So when I was thinking about giving this talk, I was doing my best to grapple with the significance of holding a conference on youth, inclusivity, and politics during such a critical time in the Sudanese political, social, and economic atmosphere. And that seems to be a sentiment since 2018, 2019, the idea that Sudan is in like a critical moment or a critical situation with ample opportunity for reform, change, and realizing the ambitions of the 2019 revolution. And so ultimately, although those sentiments are pertinent in the current moment, they are not foreign to Sudan. Sudan has had a long history of revolutions led by the youth, which presented a chance for the government to rewrite pre-existing political, social, and economic constructs. But for one reason or another, ambitions have never been fully realized. So the purpose of my talk isn't necessarily to provide a timeline of the previous transition periods or the faults of electoral practices, as important as those factors are, but it's more to identify common themes and concepts as a way to historically contextualize the forthcoming 2022 general elections. So the question I would like to begin with today is, can we look at the current and forthcoming moment as an extension of past attempts to reform Sudan's political landscape? How can we look at the history to make more sense of current dynamics while still considering the present on its own terms? And historically, the youth have always been at the forefront of Sudanese revolutions. So what happens to these youth after the regimes are toppled? Just to briefly go over the timeline that I'm just looking at to contextualize it, I'm going to analyze this within the context from 1953, accumulating to the 2019 revolution. And 1953 marks the first national election in Sudan. 1964 is significant because it was the October uprising. And following that, there was the formation of a transitional coalition government. In 1969, we have Nimeri and the Free Officers movement staging a coup, and that marks the beginning of Nimeri's 17-year rule. In 1985, the April uprising. In 1989, the Bashir regime begins, and all of this culminating to the 2019 revolution. And the way I want to discuss these events is to highlight themes that may hold relevance for 2022, and through examining concepts of contestation and inclusivity and participation. So with relation to just kind of the concept of contestation, I'm going to define it for the purpose of this talk as a process of criticism and that brings about economic, social, and political change and challenge to the state through a collective struggle. And I want to just highlight how contestation can exist in many forms. It can exist in high politics, so within the realm of political negotiations, within parliaments, within political elites, but it can also exist on the ground, right? It can exist in the form of a revolution contesting the state. And during the previous revolution, we saw that happening. We saw the youth at the forefront contesting the Bashir regime. And previously, we've seen contestation take many different types of forms. In 1953, contestation took a form of us versus them, the Sudanese versus British rule versus Egyptian rule. In 1964, we see contestation from the youth and the masses taking the form of the October Revolution, which brought down Ibrahim Aboud's regime. And we also saw contestation in high politics, particularly party politics, struggles between traditionalists and communist forces, splits within parties like the Ummah Party. And throughout Nimeri's rule, we saw contestation take also several different forms, such as Nimeri's coup himself, opposition parties challenging Nimeri throughout his rule as much as they could, and finally the October uprising, which brought him down. And since 1989, contestation has taken different forms as well, through resistance from marginalized communities against the Bashir regime, the protests of 2011 and 2013, and finally the most recent protests. So much of Sudanese political history has been about this struggle, right? About this political struggle, both on the ground, but also within party politics, within the parties themselves, but also amongst each other. And we see that even today with the current Sovereign Council. And it's clear that political contestation and participation in politics often creates a disconnect between those on the ground and those sitting in parliament making those decisions. So when I talk about inclusivity and representation, which is my next point, I talk about it within the context that inclusivity and representation have been very difficult to come by for most of Sudan's most recent history. As previously mentioned by some of the speakers before, inclusivity and participation in the 29 revolution was remarkable, but as time has gone on, that has wavered off a bit. The people that were leading the revolution, the women, the youth, those from outside of Khartoum, have been edged out politically. And history is somewhat repeating itself with the nature of the Khartoum-centric version of Sudanese politics, those that have a seat at the table. And in a country like Sudan, this is extremely important, where previous governments have instilled violence throughout the country, but particularly outside of the capital. Inclusivity and inclusion cannot be used as buzzwords. Sudan has had internal conflict and systemic violence for most of its recent history, and that's an important thing to grapple with and to recognize. And even throughout Sudan's multi-party period, so speaking specifically in that context about the transitional periods that we experienced after the 64 and 85 revolutions, inclusion has still been hard to come by. Within Sudanese high politics, it has been the same political parties with the same figureheads negotiating during these transition periods. This is dangerous because while revolutions can advocate for inclusion, what happens at the negotiating table can be very different. With that being said, I guess what I'm trying to explain with that is that even multi-party politics don't automatically mean representation. A lot of elections remain within the same circles, and this raises a lot of questions. For instance, where do the people on the ground fit in? Where does civil society fit in? What role do they play in democratization or within building Sudan, besides being rushed to the ballots, and in the neoliberal sense, rushed to the ballots and democratization in that. And what happens when the government doesn't promote inclusivity and participation? And I think Sudan's history has shown a lot of that, feeding into further isolation in already marginalized groups, which has historically led to violence. With that being said, the 2022 elections, which are meant to be held in late 2022, are definitely an opportunity for hope. I'm not trying to say that we should be pessimistic about what is to come, but I am trying to say that we can't approach this in an ahistorical manner. I want to emphasize that the point of this discussion and this talk was by no means an attempt to provide a cautionary tale for the future, but to point to how political contestation, inclusivity, and representation, peace processes, and conflict have manifested and impacted democratization in the not-so-distant past. This talk offers no solutions, but I would like to offer a deeper insight into the complex issues that have been facing us recently. And within the context of just Sudan, as we know it today, and as Sudanese history has revealed, the stories of our uprisings and our transitions are moments of opportunity that each need to be studied in their own right. Blatant disavowal of patterns of repression and marginalization have historically intervened in these moments, but that is not to say that our history is finite by any means, or that we should be afraid of any delays that may occur. What will unburden us or contribute to reform may change from one day to the next, but a retrospective gaze is what is necessary to employ in order to grapple with the current moment that we're in, where the situation we are currently facing is both old and new at the same time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Aida. I don't think many people knows you that you are a great-granddaughter of Jamal Muhammad Ahmed, the former well-known diplomat and writer and a friend of mine for years and years. So we are very glad to have you on board talking about politics and the election. My only observation or my experience in Sudan since the 1960s until the present time is this disjoint between city people, the FNDO sitting in offices, and the rural areas. And that is really a very big problem. This instability and upheaval in the Sudan is that people are not taken on board from the rural areas into the city. It's always the city impose itself on the rural areas because they think the rural areas, people in the rural are not intelligent. They don't understand politics, which is a totally wrong perception of those people in the rural area. Perhaps somebody will raise this issue with you, but I come back to the last speaker. Thank you, Aida. Muhammad Sharfi, whom I know, is very kind that Muhammad is a senior consultant at the Diplomatic Institute in the state of Qatar. And he previously worked for the United Nations in Sudan and Switzerland. And he is information analyst and human rights officer. He is going to talk about, he's independent researcher. He's going to talk about the changing political landscape and the youth aspect dynamics in the Republic of Sudan. The platform is for you, Mohammed. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for this opportunity. I would like to argue in this talk that there is a significant change in the political landscape in Sudan. and this is due to the unprecedented changes in the last 30 years of the National Salvation Revolution. We witnessed a lot of huge political, economic, social changes. And there are some factors that I'm going to discuss them in those 10 minutes briefly about why this argument will shape the political map of Sudan in the coming democratic experience. As some of the participants mentioned, that the youth has they were the main mobilizing force for this for the success of the revolution, and the Sudanese Professional Association was the leading organization in toppling Bashir regime. The political parties until the end of the regime, they were hesitant in order to join the protest movement. However, they joined in the end, and then they formed the Forces for Freedom and Change Declaration. I would like to go to the impact of the National Salvation Revolution, 30 years, in terms of changing politics in Sudan. They use coercion, they use intimidation, divide and rule, and this has really affected the political parties and political forces in Sudan. And they target also their financial resources. My argument is based on different factors. There are certain issues that lead us to this argument, that there is a significant change in the political landscape in Sudan. So those factors, I have to say, one of them is the demographic transformation in Sudan. The second one is the decline of traditional parties in Sudan. The third one is the fragmentation of political parties in Sudan. The fourth one is the waning interest in political parties in terms of the youth, generally speaking. In terms of the demographic transformation, as some of the participants mentioned, is that more than 61% of the populations are under the age of 25. This is according to the UN 2019 census data. Also, the changes in Darfur population, which is a stronghold for the traditional parties. The changes in terms of IDPs. Now there are some data saying that 40% of Sudan is urbanized. Also, the issues related to traditional leadership in Sudan, in general speaking, and how they fragmented traditional leadership in terms of the National Salvation Revolution. The second one is the decline of traditional parties. Through those 30 years, we witnessed the decline of traditional parties. In 2011, we witnessed that very clearly when al-Bashir appointed the son of the DUP leader, Mohammed Jafar al-Marghani, and also the son of the late Sadiq al-Mahdi as his assistants. People in Sudan, mainly the youth, they started to perceive the traditional leaders as they don't have a strategy to oppose or to put a strategy in order to bring down the regime. The third aspect is the fragmentation of political parties. We also see fragmentation in different political parties, whether the ideological parties, the communist parties, the Ba'athist party, the traditional parties as well. In 2011, Ummah Party has 7 political parties, fragmented into 7 political parties. The DUP to 6 political parties. The Communist Party, they're very prominent figures in the Communist Party. They branch out from the Communist Party, like Khidr, something Khidr. So this fragmentation really weakened the political parties. In this context, I have to remind that when the negotiation to set the transitional period, there was a talk about 4 years, and this is mainly to give political parties opportunity to re-energize themselves and to reorganize themselves. And this is one of the problems, is that still they couldn't appeal to the masses in Sudan. They couldn't deliver their agenda and to try to present themselves mainly to the youth. The fourth issue is the waning interest in political parties. In the last 30 years, and due to the failure of political parties to put a strategy in order to struggle against the regime, most of the youth, they started to join civil society organizations. And some of them are very successful, like Grifna, We Are Fed Up, or Youth for Change. And those two organizations were successful in actually starting protest movements in 2011 and 2013. Women as well, they have a lot of contribution on that in terms of civil society organization. This setting demonstrate how youth perceive political parties and their failure in order to present an appeal to the society in order to oppose the National Salvation Revolution. This context present a picture of there's some scenarios can happen according to this argument that there is a change in political landscape. There are some writers now talking about youth has a huge opportunity in order to make their own political party. If they were able to mobilize the youth and to establish, there is a void in terms of political parties. There is a possibility for youth to establish political parties, and they can be very successful. In conclusion, there are some scenarios that will lead this context will lead to some scenarios, different scenarios that maybe I will discuss them in another talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Really, you set the scene. I have one observation before I hand into Richard, is that all political parties in Sudan, they don't have any manifesto or constitution to distribute. I don't know what the Ummah is about or the Khatmiyyah. These traditional allegiances based on religious affiliation. What are they going to do in relation to economy, in relation to border, in relation to relationship with neighboring countries? There is nothing there to read, or changing manifestos of constitution. That is a lacking. Any democracy, parties must have a manifesto to tell the nation what they're going to do, what policies they're going to pursue. This is lacking in the whole. Tell me, I'll be very interested to hear if there is something like this available to read, or a changing one. I have no idea, but this is for Aida too to take on board when she is going to do her research in Durham. But let me just finish and thank you all very, very much indeed for all your contributions to this event. Really, you have done extremely well, and I'm sure the audiences also were very attentive to listen to you. Is what you have is extremely important, and perhaps it will reach the authorities that there are talents in the Sudan represented in you and your contribution to the future of both Sudan and South Sudan. But thank you very much indeed. Now I hand you to Richard. Here we are, Richard. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you very much to all the speakers. I'll cluster together some of the questions that have already been submitted in the Q&A box and present those questions to the first 4 or 5 speakers, give you a chance to reply to those, and then repeat with another set of questions. And I'll see if I can open the microphone, as it were, for several questions to be put live. So going back to the beginning, the first presentations, 2 questions to Abalo on energy in South Sudan. One from was from Frank Dormoni, a question about electricity options in South Sudan. I think his question was whether the construction of large electricity grids is a viable route, or whether microgrids, small local grids, is a better option. And a second question from Peter Justin regarding energy in South Sudan was about the potential impact on charcoal collectors, poor charcoal collectors. What would be the potential impact on them of reduction in charcoal collection? So those are 2 questions for Abalo. A question to Elizabeth on aid in South Sudan, or 2 questions from me, these would be. Firstly, Elizabeth, whether you see any progress in South Sudan on progress on localizing humanitarian aid, localizing aid. A few years ago in the World Humanitarian Summit, one of the goals set for humanitarian aid was to localize aid. And a second question on aid is whether any comments you have about the challenge of shifting from humanitarian aid to development aid, possibly through focusing on resilience building aid. So those are 2 questions to you, Elizabeth. Haneen, a question to you on women and youth women and youth. There was a question from Jihad Mashaloon, whether gender inequality is also a result of attitudes or practices or policies in other political parties, and what could be done to change attitudes. I think you've responded to that in chat, but maybe you'd like to say something more. I'll pause there. That's questions to 3 speakers and then take the next batch. Thank you. So maybe Abalo, if you'd like to go first.
All right. Well, thank you for the 2 questions. I'll start with the first one about the large and small grid lines. So basically the main grid and the mini grid. I think both, in my personal opinion, both are really viable for South Sudan. If you look at areas where there's a lot of resources, you will need to find a way to transmit these resources or this energy from these resources to where the demand is. So because the demand is really not equally distributed from one region to another, if you look at the demand versus the supply, or in terms of resource, you will need a main grid for that. Mini grid will work best in cities or small towns, but you will definitely need big main grid lines from one region to another. And the second question was about charcoal reduction on charcoal traders, is it?
Yes, what would be the impact on, or what can be done to help charcoal collectors with the challenges they face?
Okay, so most of the charcoal activity that happens in South Sudan are mainly from illegal cutting down of trees. So in a way, if the charcoal demand reduces, it's a win for the forest, but I can understand it's a minus for the traders because that's their source of income. But this is where there should be some form of compensation for them. I hope the government can listen and programs can be drafted where they can be compensated somehow, but this should only be applied to the charcoal traders who have been doing illegal activities when it comes to cutting down trees. But knowing South Sudan, I doubt most of them are legally cutting down the trees. So they may have to be creative in finding option B.
Thanks, Abello. Thank you for that. Elizabeth, could we pass to you if you'd like to say anything on the question of whether there's been progress on localizing humanitarian aid in South Sudan and the challenge of shifting from humanitarian to developmental aid?
Thank you very much. Regarding the first question on localizing aid, this has so much to do with the capacity and the skills of the local NGOs themselves, because I understand that localizing aid is partnering with the organization themselves, rather than just giving and then giving instructions and funds and monitoring and everything by the donors, if I'm right, of course. So I think local NGOs need a lot of work, and to be honest with you, even the issue of building capacity and skills for local NGOs in South Sudan is another challenge for foreign aid to yield any good results, because there is a lot of bureaucracy that comes in with the international NGOs that are supposed to help in building these capacities and skills. So the government has so much to do, and they intentionally ignore their roles. I think so much could be done in this regard, but with serious commitment from our leaders. This is what I would say in the first question, in regards to the first question. The second question, shifting from humanitarian aid and possibility. This is going to be so difficult in the current situation in South Sudan, because as I explained in my paper earlier, over 60%, like the vast majority of the population they're actually surviving on humanitarian aid. South Sudan is solely depending on oil revenues for almost everything and aid. So this will take time for other sectors to start developing and yielding revenues whereby humanitarian aid can start declining. I don't think this is something that can happen right now. It will take a lot of serious commitment as well from policymakers, and again, it goes back to the leaders and decision makers.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Thanks for the response. Could I pass to Haneen if you would like to say something more than regarding the role of other political parties in contributing to or changing attitudes about women and youth participation in politics. And just to add to that, in your response in one of the chats, you mentioned that some of the other political parties have brought about women's participation up to a level of 40%. And so the question I'd ask there is, do you see a good use for, or do you think it would be useful to have more use of quotas or targets for women's participation in political parties and in institutions, with political institutions, governance institutions? Thank you. Over to you, Haneen.
Yes, sure, it would be useful if they want to imply it, or they agree to imply it in the political parties. But unfortunately, only Ummah and Sudanese Congress parties have a constitution that contains quotas of women participation. Till now, also for the youth participation, I think it's 20% for youth and university students. Other parties still have very weak participations, women participations.
Thank you, Haneen. Ida, would you like to to say anything about this as well? As you spoke on the subject of elections and political parties, do you see a value in greater use of quotas?
I do see a value in the use of quotas, but I feel like there's some nuances with relation to it. For instance, the Sudanese Communist Party did improve women's participation to 40%, but over time we saw that falter quite a bit. So I think for me, the question is more, it's fine to instill the quotas, but how do we maintain that? How do we ensure that in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that those will be maintained? And how do we also, in those meeting rooms and at the table, how are we ensuring that the women are given the space to participate on the matters that matter to their community and to them and to their own struggles? I feel like, yeah, so I think quotas need to be applied in that matter.
Mohammed Shafi, would you like to respond as well on this? The question had been put whether the other political parties, putting aside the National Congress Party and from the past, the present day established political parties, whether they can do more for making progress on gender equality and women's participation in politics, or participation of other disadvantaged groups. And do you think there's a good use could be made of quotas by those political parties?
I think most political parties now, they started to understand very well the importance of those segments you talked about. And there's some progress. I mean, in terms of the Sudanese Congress Party, for example, this is an emerging political party in Sudan. And most of it is leading members are youth, Hizb al-Mu'tamar al-Sudani, Sudanese Congress Party. This is a new political party, which was, there are many people in Sudan, generally speaking, they are really inspired by their leaders in terms of mobilizing. They were a part of the mobilizing force against the National Salvation Revolution. But yes, I think in terms of gender, there are a lot of talk about how women are not represented during the negotiation between the military council and the forces for freedom and FFC. There are a lot of talks about that, but the signs are there in terms of now the appointments in the Council of Ministers, in terms of the high leadership in the state at the moment. So I think political parties is no longer the same as 4 decades ago or something like that.
Richard?
Yes?
I have written an article in late 60s on an election of 1968 in one constituency. I think one must not underestimate the role of women in politics, in election particularly. I found out from the election result that if you take women votes in numbers and you latch it on the 3 candidates who stood in that constituency, every one of them would have won that constituency. You see how important women voting in election is. And then even the 3 of them, they were surprised, or 2 of them at least, surprised that what one of them said, I think Jabhat al-Mithaq al-Islami is a sort of the Muslim Brother candidate. He said, X won Bal-Hiramat, which was really a terrible thing to say, that he won Bal-Hiramat, demeaning women, their role in politics. I think that is really, in a sense, to this now, women are essential in any election. And it has to be realized this is the case. Sorry, Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'll move to a next batch of questions, which are in the same area, political. And these 2 questions will be addressed to Bush and Amal. Bush, one question from the audience was from Nazar, was how to go about building bridges between youth and elders. And a second question, which I'd put there, focused on South Sudan, is, are youth in South Sudan going to modernize South Sudan's old parties, or are they going to have to organize a revolution or be in the forefront of a revolution in the future, as has happened in Sudan? And then secondly, a question to you, Amal. In the chat, you had already been asked and you've responded to the question of whether you'd seen a book, Tuskut, about the art of the revolution. And following on from that question, you talked about the space for creative expression, artistic expression, which flourished during the revolution and the sit-in, and you spoke about needs now since then. What's the political space? What's the situation in terms of the political space for encouraging creative arts at the moment? And so those two sets of questions, Bush and Amal. Amal, would you like to respond to the questions that were put to you?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, because I guess I come from a space of the creative arts being one of the most important platforms for expression, and that art leads into everything. You know, it leads into politics. It can lead into the culture. It really is, I guess, the soul of a society is the artists and the creatives. So in terms of political expression, I think that at the moment we're in a very critical time, as many of the speakers have spoken about, and there's lots of investment coming into Sudan at the moment. And what I fear is that there's going to be a prioritization on, you know, some of the more, I guess, technical infrastructures, like, you know, the financial infrastructures that will support the country. But I think that I'm fearful that there'll be a continued devaluation of the creative arts, which shouldn't be the case, because as we've seen in the revolution, it was one of the things that were at the forefront of the revolution that really galvanized the youth and also helped them to express what they wanted in Sudan. You know, if people weren't speaking with their mouths about what was happening, they were singing songs like, you know, Habobti Kandaka, or they were, you know, drawing graffiti all over the walls, expressing their views. So I think that at the moment, in terms of politics, what needs to happen is politicians who have the means to really advocate for the creative arts need to be doing that. They need to be taking a hold of those spaces and explaining how important it is that there's necessary investment, I guess, put into it. So I think that in terms of the political realm, that's what needs to happen. So as, you know, the councils are coming together and as investments are coming in, there also needs to be that recognition of we need to set aside some finances to be investing in our creative and cultural institutions. I wouldn't even say just invest in the cultural institution, I'll say build them, because in all honesty, there isn't that much currently in Sudan that I know of. But if anybody has any new and up and coming in you know, initiatives that have been occurring, then please do let me know, because I may just be ignorant to them. But at the moment, institutionally, there just isn't enough within Sudan to really raise and give a platform for creative expression. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Amal. Thanks for the reply. Bush, are you able to unmute and reply as well? We can't hear Bush at the moment, so I will move on to some other questions, and hopefully we'll be able to hear from Bush in a little while. Thuiba, your presentation about migration brings to mind one or two questions that I'd like to put. Whether is anything being done in Sudan at the moment to develop a positive policy, a government policy for controlled, managed migration. And so the question is anything being done to promote managed migration in Sudan, or at least to develop a policy for it? And then secondly, is there anything or anything interesting about the role of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, in trying to control or prevent illicit migration?
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. About the first question, I think regarding the management of migration, I think this is quite complicated, because when we talk about migration, we're talking about irregular migrants. And the issues about the irregular migrants, I think currently Sudan, they are, the government, they are really busy about the current situation, the economic situation in all the country. But still there is a role of international community that communities are trying to support in regard to provide funds to the government. I think they did kind of investment regarding to the law, as I mentioned, especially about smuggling and trafficking. And about the migration now, they have already started some projects. They're trying to integrate the migrants. They can have access to the health and education system. So somehow it's still within the current situation, still they're trying to do their best. But it still is not like the best way, like we can say, because generally the situation, even for the host community, is really complicated. So, but still they are trying to do some kind of work. And about the role of RSF, well, I think most of you, they are aware about the role of RSF regarding the migration, especially in Libya, and some people that they used to accuse the European Union in regard about their collaboration with the RSF. But now the situation of the RSF is different than in the past. Now the RSF, they are part of the government, they are part of the Sudan. Whether you agree or disagree, but still they are doing some kind of role. But about the migration, I think the political situation in the country do not allow let us say, like, even for the smugglers of the traffickers to move freely, like compared with the past. Because now overall situation is messy. People that are trying to do their best. But as FML, I think still they are doing some kind of work, because they have been part of different, Hemeti himself, he mentioned a lot that he's doing his best regarding to the migration issue. I cannot guarantee that they are now currently doing something, but still now they are part of the military groups in Sudan, so I'm sure they are doing some kind of work. I don't know whether I answer your questions or not, but I was trying to.
Thank you, Thariba. That's appreciated. Bush, I think you're unmuted now. So the
Thank you so much.
Questions to you. One question was how to build bridges between youth and elders, and then second question was, are youth going to modernize the old parties of South Sudan, or are they going to have to organize in the front of a future revolution?
Thank you so much. These are great questions. Regarding the question on building bridges between the youth and elders, I would say that young people or the youth need to do more of lobbying and advocacy to ensure that their voices are heard, because this generation is very hard for you to ask to be given something, but then youth need to have a different thinking of taking what belongs to them instead of asking to be given. So that requires a lot to be done as youth by doing lobbying and advocacy. For example, in South Sudan, there's been an increased civic activism, which has led to some improvement. We have a number of young people who are now in position of power, and also the same thing in Sudan. The second thing that can be done is a sort of intergenerational dialogue between the youth and the elders to bridge the gap. That is to say, we are not completely against the elders because of age, but that there are certain policies which are not relevant to our context, and that there are a lot of wrong things which are happening in South Sudan and also in Sudan which need to be challenged. And this can only happen through a peaceful way. That is some kind of intergenerational dialogue between the youth and the elders. If you compare Sudan, South Sudan, and the developed world, you realize that actually the two countries are very rich. They have a lot of natural resources, but they have not benefited from all these potentials, the God's given graces that we have. In 2019, when I was in Norway giving a presentation on similar topic, one of the Norwegians told me that they have reserved for the next 5 generations. But then if we can ask the two Sudans, South Sudan and Sudan now, the funds that we have, is it enough for us even? Okay, because they are in those countries, they are talking about having reserves fund for the next 5 generations. But for us here, what we have now is not even enough for us. We see many people are suffering. That is to say, this generation that is in leadership, the generation of elders in leadership is struggling with a lot of challenges that need to be challenged through so many means: lobbying, advocacy, intergenerational dialogue. And the context here in Sudan, relating to the second question of revolution, like what happened in Sudan, I would say the context of Sudan is quite different from South Sudan at the moment, in that even the revolution in Sudan, it took a lot of time. People had to strategize. There were plans that took so many years, okay? And so if South Sudan is to have any revolution, then there are still priorities that need to be done. Number one, we have fragmentation, okay? A very serious fragmentation of young people in South Sudan, in that we still have many young people who are following these elders, okay? The wrong elders. And I'm not saying all the elders are bad, but there are those who are not doing the right thing. And they have succeeded in militarizing the youth in South Sudan. They have succeeded in politicizing the youth to follow them and also to fight for their ideologies. So this is still a challenge within the group of the youth. So youth have to get organized. They have to get united, fight the negative tribalism, and also get to understand that, in fact, what we are having now in South Sudan is not good. There are many young people who do not know what is good for them, okay? So, for example, we need to get educated. We need to get informed of what is good for us as young people. If we get to know what is good for us, then election is coming. We are more than 70% as youth, so we can determine the future of South Sudan that we want. And I think that is the same message to Sudan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bush. I think we've got time for probably only one last question, and this will be a question to Noon and Moram about the subject of maternal health and women and girls and their rights regarding FGM and their full rights. Are there champions for change in this and the related areas of women's rights? Are there champions for change, for positive change, champions in high government and in the political parties? Noon, would you like to go first, and then Moram? Thank you.
Sure. Well, for the past few years, my work has mostly been academic and research based, but what I'm thinking of is, so I went to Ahmad University, and I think I could proudly say it's one of the biggest champions on improving maternal health in Sudan. I've also had the opportunity to work in some institutes that works to improve maternal health. So I guess my short answer would be yes, but I'm not really part of the field at the moment. So to be able to answer that, I think I was browsing through the attendees list, and there was Professor Nafisa Badri, if I'm not mistaken, and I've seen quite a lot of her work. So I would, yeah, there are definitely a lot of champions there. Yeah.
Thank you, Noon. Moram, would you like to say anything in response to the question of whether there are champions for change regarding women and girls' rights and FGM, or more broadly?
I mean, like Noon, I'd say I'm not really in the field at the moment in terms of being in Sudan, but I do definitely think that there are champions for change. I mean, I do think that with everything that's going on at the moment, a lot of people are fighting for this at the moment, and I think in terms of equality within Sudan in general, and women's rights and maternal health, and you know, issues that affect women in general, I do think that it's a case of people are fighting for it more now because they are more aware, because you know it's a series of years that they have tried to fight for it, but they've not been heard. And I think also with the revolution, people are seeing that, you know, in terms of there being change, or in terms of if everyone comes together as a collective, they can actually, like we've seen, topple the government, for example. So I do think that if this does carry on, I do definitely think there's champions change.
And just to add on, I think it's really important to also acknowledge that this is actually a lot of hard work, because in the sense of so I focus on maternal mortality, and this is a topic that's very easy to talk about in the community, but having discussions about maternal health, about family planning, these are very difficult conversations, and we still need to, I think it needs to be explicitly part of the conversation within the community, but it would be difficult for people to take these on. I'm not sure if we're ready for these kind of conversations at the moment. And many people who are in the field and who are talking about it would often tend to focus on some extreme parts of the spectrum. So again, on maternal mortality, maternal morbidity, I think these are more palatable to us now, as opposed to tackling maternal health as across the spectrum.
Yeah, sorry, just to add on, I definitely agree with Noon there. I do think that in terms of tackling these issues, we have to think of, like I said before, the cultural barriers that stand in our way. So it's going to take a few years to actually, you know, change the mentality that some people within Sudan have. And this isn't to say that, you know, what they're thinking is we're judging them, or, you know, we're here telling them, no, you can't think in that way. It's the way that they've been brought up. So it's not something that we can suddenly come in and just be like, you know, you have to think in a different way. You have to adapt to how the world sees things now. It's something that's going to take a bit of time. And I definitely think that, you know, through just these protests, through just raising awareness, I do think that eventually we can get to a point where there will be change. And I do think that in terms of the youth, a lot of people are now more open to the idea of change in women's rights and women's equality in general. And I do think that the youth is now showing that they are trying to fight for this cause as well.
Elizabeth has her hand up. I think she would like to say something.
Okay.
Elizabeth?
Yes, I just wanted to add that there are actual role models taking this course and fighting on the ground. These are people that we don't know about them. My current project that I'm working on is in Tuti Island. And for many of us here know that Tuti is one of the most conservative places in Khartoum, the capital. And I was surprised to see old women at the age of 70s who attended the flood of 1946 and leading such kind of initiatives against FGM and talking about it publicly. So there are actually some champions and role models working on this on the ground in the community, the Sudanese community. I'm so happy about the shifting that is happening, the cultural shift that is happening in among the Sudanese people. Unlike in us, in our community in South Sudan, like my brother Bush mentioned, I think the dynamics are so different, and it will take a lot of time before South Sudanese people realize that we have to prioritize and think in a more nationalist way, rather than think of us as ethnic groups and this kind of divisions that we have. Then after that we can work together collectively to fight other issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Ahmed,
I just want to say that the issue of FGM was raised in the British Parliament in 1949 and is all mentioned in Hansard. These are the minutes or the discussion in Parliament. And Professor Sir Edward Evans Pritchard was asked about it, saying because of his speciality in Sudan. And Evans Pritchard replied to the Minister of Colonies at that time, is called, saying, well, you cannot really, you have to understand the FGM in the context, social and cultural context, rather than just the law. You pass a law. Law doesn't work. As indeed, since beginning of the 20th century, law has been passed that this is illegal, the religious authorities saying this is not the case, yet people went on. And you have to tackle the social system. And I repeat, to deconstruct the mind, the attitude of people, both men and women, that this is dangerous physically, psychologically, and it's not in the interest of women and even men to do so. So it has, the British never forgotten this issue. 49, I thought, I came across it just really by chance reading something, then I went to Hansard, and there it was, all the discussion about it in Parliament.
I mean, just to add to that, actually, I recently read an article about how they're trying to tackle FGM within Sudan, mainly looking at rural areas. And I think what was happening was they were trying to speak to religious advisors, religious leaders, and mainly going into mosques and just raising awareness of the dangers of FGM. And I think a lot of these speakers that were going into mosques were midwives that had actually performed the acts of FGM before. And now obviously they've stopped because I know it's illegal, but also at the same time, they're not openly performing the act anymore. So I think it has helped in a few states. I know in Kassala it did work in a few places where the cases have gone down a bit. But like we said, it's just a way of having to deconstruct the minds of the elder generation, just so that we don't change. I mean, so it doesn't go down to the youngers, so that we can think of it in a different way.
By the way, the British government legislated against it in 1985. Because one of the nurses in one of the private clinics, I think the London clinic in London, spilled the bean publicly. I saw her on television saying this young girl was circumcised for no reason whatsoever. And the British government saw this as an evidence how, doctors do this totally in contradiction of their own mission in life, that how could you do something like this where there is no what they call anatomical or physiological need for this, and hence the British government legislate. But yet the problem is people do take their daughters back at home, whether Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan, or anywhere else, have them bring them back again, and the problem arises here, with the national health because of complications.
Ahmed, we've reached the end of
we have reached indeed. I'm just about to say, and to thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, you like to say something?
Thanks to all the speakers for responding to the questions and answers. And back to you, Achu.
Our next event will be held in Manchester, face-to-face, I hope, on governance in Southern Sudan on 23rd of October, 2021. And we hope in between now and October, we may be able to organize another event, and the trustees will be discussing this at their next trustees meeting. But anyhow, I reiterate our thanks for all of you for your contribution. You are the future of the Sudan and South Sudan. And I hope your authorities would listen to you and listen to your presentation, because these really very important contribution. For policy making, as well as for your place in Sudan and South Sudan. You need to be listened to. And thank you very much again on behalf of the Sudanese Programme for participating and making these contributions. And we wish you a very good luck and best wishes, and thank you. And thank you, Richard, for chairing the question and answer. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Take care. Keep safe and stay well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
And you too. Thank you.